From the far reaches of the Milky Way galaxy, it's Retro Nerd Girl with a film review for you. Today, I'll be reviewing the movie Queen of the Damned, released in 2002. Starring Stuart Townsend, Marguerite Moreau, and Aaliyah. Directed by Michael Reimer. The synopsis is, the vampire Lestat becomes a rock star whose music awakens the queen of all vampires, who wants to reign the earth again, with him at her side. The story. American author of Gothic fiction, erotic literature, and Christian literature, Howard Allen Francis O'Brien, otherwise known as Anne Rice, wrote the book Interview with a Vampire, published in May of 1976. The book was heavily influenced by Anne's real-life trauma of losing her young daughter, Michelle, nicknamed Mouse, who died of an acute form of leukemia in 1972, shortly before she would have turned 6. She connected Michelle's blood affliction with vampirism, which birthed a series of books, The Vampire Chronicles. It centered around the fictional character of Lestat de Liancourt, a French nobleman turned into a vampire in the 18th century. The first book was poorly received. That's something I never understood because it's an excellent book, but it was a decade ahead of its time. Sure enough, 9 years later, she followed up with the novel The Vampire Lestat in 1985, which was a success and debuted at number 9 on the New York Times bestseller list and spent a total of 6 weeks on the list. The Vampire Lestat ended with a cliffhanger and demanded another book in the series. In 1988, The Queen of the Damned was published and reached the number 1 spot on the New York Times bestseller list, staying on the list for more than 4 months. It was also a main selection of the Library Guild of America for that year. I remember working at a bookstore in the early 1990s, and Anne Rice's books were a top seller for years and years. Many of the readers of The Queen of the Damned knew that they had to read the first 2 books in order to understand the scope of the story, which each book wonderfully delivered. I was among those readers. Anne built a whole new world of vampire lore to excite a growing vampire-loving community in the late 1980s and 1990s. With such a following, it was soon that Hollywood came knocking on Anne's door in the form of Warner Brothers to adapt her books. The first to be adapted was The Interview with the Vampire, released in 1994, starring Tom Cruise as Lestat. At first, Anne and the fans of the series weren't happy that Tom was cast, but with careful attention to makeup, Tom's dedication to the role, he defined the role in a new way while honoring the written character. It was a success, being the 10th highest grossing movie of 1994, earning 2 Oscar nominations. So naturally, a sequel was in the works. Or was it? Anne wanted to be involved in any way possible to help bridge the gap between from the movie and what she wrote. This would have also excited the fans of her novels. She even offered to write a script for free. However, Warner Brothers ignored her and the property for years. In a mad dash to use the property before the rights went back to Anne in the year 2000, in 1999, Scott Abbott and Michael Petroni were hired to write a screenplay. Australian filmmaker Michael Reimer was hired to direct. Instead of tackling the direct sequel, Scott Abbott had the idea to combine The Vampire Lestat and The Queen of the Damned into one movie, taking the connective tissue between the 2 books and discarding most of the rest. Seeing how problematic that would be, Reimer suggested that the project be a miniseries, but that was shot down immediately. As well, none of the actors returned from Interview with a Vampire, and the overall look of the movie was drastically different. With that as it was, the story is not perfect. The script in particular had some cringy moments that didn't work. But on the other hand, it does have a few good unforgettable moments where it leaned more heavily into the source material and kind of riffed off of that. That is when the film is the most fun, when it's playing with those themes. Now the pacing. At an hour and 41 minutes, it feels a little bit too long in some parts, and in other parts, one desires more time with the characters. So I think here we're dealing with time management when trying to figure out what didn't quite work. There's a lot of time given to dull concepts, but there were also wonderful little splashes of content that thoroughly entertained me. Now the challenge. The challenge in this film starts out a bit ambiguous, being the ups and downs for Lestat after being turned into a vampire and figuring out how to live as such. The film has a character by the name of Marius, who turns Lestat into a vampire for the convenience of keeping the story tight. However, in the book, the vampire Lestat was turned into a vampire by a powerful 300-year-old vampire by the name of Magnus, okay? Why they did not add Magnus to this story is beyond me, because he's not in the book for very long, but he is so striking and incredibly eerie. We're going to get back to Magnus a little bit later on in the review, but what a character. I wish he was in the film, even for a moment. But in the film, Marius is Lestat's teacher, from which he learns the ways of the vampire. And he discovers the statues of two ancient vampires by the name of Enko and Akasha. They're also called the ones who must be kept. Akasha is the main challenge of the film, but she's hardly in it. The film spends a great deal of time setting us up for when she's finally awakened by Lestat's music in the early 2000s. Now, sadly, it takes 51 minutes into the runtime of the film to even get there. But once she appears, the appeal of the character left an iconic imprint on audiences with only 20 minutes of screen time. Now let's go over her backstory, which I would have loved to have seen in this movie. Akasha was queen 6,000 years before Egypt was even established as a nation in a land called Kemet, with her husband King Enko. The village of two powerful red-headed twin witches by the name of Maharet and Makar were destroyed. The twins were imprisoned by the royal couple and questioned about what they knew about the infinite. However, they refused. In anger, they were publicly violated and abandoned in the desert. The king and queen were harassed by a bloodthirsty spirit by the name of Amel, who were, I wouldn't say friends with the twins, but he was attached to them in some way. And the king and queen were forced to summon the twins from the desert to exorcise the spirit. During the exorcism, assassins attacked Eniko and Akasha, and as the queen was dying, Amel attached himself to her soul and dragged it back into her body. This is very detailed. And in that moment, she then became the very first vampire. She saved Eniko, who was dying from his wounds, and turned him into a vampire as well. So they were the first two vampires. Akasha and Eniko were so bloodthirsty, they ravaged the lands and turned so many people into vampires. But after a while, they lost their thirst for blood and eventually became living statues. However, other vampires soon realized that the statues had to be looked after, because what happens to the statues also happens to all vampires. Once upon a time, the statues were exposed to sunlight, and most of the younger vampires died, but the older ones were hurt, but they survived. Marius was made the keeper of the statues in both the book and the movie. One day, while Lestat was playing on his violin in Marius's castle, he found Akasha and played his violin for her. In return, Akasha's statue actually moves and offers him some of her ancient blood. thus increasing his strength. What the book also included was that Inigo was not just a bystander. All of this activity woke him as well, and he would have killed Lestat if it weren't for Marius saving his life in the nick of time. Now, I'm not sure why this wasn't included in the movie, but that's another exciting moment that would have been awesome to see on screen. Out of fear and maybe out of jealousy, Marius moved the statues to a new hidden location, abandoning Lestat. Centuries later, Lestat's music awoke Akasha once more. She turns into flesh after draining Inigo of all of his blood, thus killing him and choosing Lestat as her new companion. Akasha's appearance is the main event of the film, inserting it with a lot of excitement, a lot of much needed excitement, mystery, danger, and a boost of sensuality. She goes searching for him, where she senses a large gathering of vampires at the Admiral's Arms vampire bar in London. This is one of my favorite locations on the film. I wish there were more scenes taking place there. After discovering that the vampires plan to destroy Lestat, she destroys them like flies. The scene itself is so powerful as she wreaks havoc without much effort at all. I mean, in fact, she's almost dancing as she flicks her wrists and sets her targets on fire to demonstrate her place as queen of them all. It's an iconic scene that is framed with so much thrill. The secondary challenge in the film are the bands or covens of vampires that want to destroy Lestat for exposing the mortal world to the notion of vampires. They want to remain in the shadows to keep their hierarchy and advantage over mortals. Their threat is quite minimal in the film. It's more theatrical than and serves as a way to demonstrate how powerful Lestat is over all of the other vampires, that he can easily defeat most of them. Now, the empathy in this film really doesn't exist. It's a weird thing to say, but this is a movie about villains and maybe one or two innocent side characters, but even they don't strum up enough empathy. Lestat is a character that is thoroughly adored by his portrayal in the books, which comes off a little differently in this movie. Much of that comes from the fact that Lestat looks nothing like how he's described in the books and how he appears in the movie Interview with a Vampire. Part of Lestat's personality was wrapped up into his blonde locks. In fact, there is a gory scene in the book, which is another scene I would have loved to have seen in this film, where he wakes up in a crypt with hundreds of decomposing bodies of blonde, blue-eyed guys that look just like him. I mean, that's totally freaky. I wish that scene had made it in the film, because it's a true horror moment, right? This is a horror movie, and that is a true horror moment. And I can imagine it played up with really awesome music in the background to really give you that feeling of fear and fright and shock. This is where the film failed to really nail the character, neither in looks or in spirit. And just to get into it a little bit more, one of the other motivations for being the man that he is in the books is because Magnus actually left Lestat to discover the ways of being a vampire on his own, which he's incredibly bitter about. If you've seen the Interview with a Vampire, he makes quite a few statements that he never learned anything from the person who made him. And it makes him cold underneath a very playful, naughty, jovial demeanor. And that's why fans of the books really love the character. However, if you can imagine that this story is not connected to the books, maybe this version of Lestat could work. And Lestat in the film is a lot like a Black Panther, kind of prowling around in a emo goth fashion. And you know what? I'm actually into it. I've always loved that aesthetic, and it's the only reason why this works for me. He's cold and bitter, but without the joviality. He's depressed, but you don't know why he's moody, with the off chance that he's flirty and darting a smirk of superiority. For this version of Lestat, the film sets up Lestat's displeasure with living in the shadows when he becomes a vampire in the 1700s. He encounters a violinist on a beach and he joins her in play. His supernatural nature alerts her and her friend that something is going on, that he's not human, and so they freak out. Unfortunately, he had to kill her, and he becomes very melancholy about that. Also, a part of his personality is that he desperately wants to be adored by others and enjoys the pleasures of being worshipped for being a godlike being. This is why he enjoys being a vampire. Having to hide his identity to keep himself and other vampires safe from human discovery is what he hates the most, and the reason why Akasha wants him. He shares her desire to live in the open. Lestat was slumbering for decades after the events of Interview with a Vampire until he hears modern music of the 2000s, which wakes him up. In the book, it was 1984. So you get the idea that the music Anne Rice had in mind was different, of big hair metal bands. However, I actually enjoyed the music using goth metal to kind of match the aesthetic of the movie. It makes the film quite special in my opinion. Lestat embodies the mesmerizing flirtiness of a rock star onto his stage performance, tapping into legendary rock gods like Jim Morrison, the lead singer for The Doors, and Robert Plant of Led Zeppelin. Lestat gets pushed into the supporting role when Akasha shows up at his concert in Death Valley and takes him to a resort where she has gone on a feeding frenzy. There she attempts to convince him to go along with her intentions to commit genocide and reboot society in order to rule over humans and vampires as a god. I rather enjoyed the seduction of Lestat, and technically, exerting his superiority over mortals would be totally up his alley. However, it says a lot about Akasha when even this version of Lestat, a cold-blooded killer with very little respect for human life, shies away from Akasha's insatiable bloodthirst. It just tickles me every time. She's just that savage. But Lestat has a very interesting relationship with Marius, who acts as his teacher, as I mentioned before. But there's kind of like a romantic tension that the film doesn't quite explore, but you know is there. But also an endearing kind of platonic kind of thing too. Relationships like these are more explored in the book, and definitely I think it may have been the time period they were too afraid to go into depth with a man-on-man love affair. And what the film does explore is a female love interest for Lestat by the name of a human, Jesse Reeves, a researcher for the paranormal studies group called the Talamasca. The character Jessie is the audience's avatar in the film. She's an outsider trying to breach her way into the vampire world. And one cool story aspect concerning Jessie is that her mentor, David Talbot, gives her Lestat's journal to read, and it allows the audience to glimpse into Lestat's early days as a vampire. I thought that was really done well. It's one of the most enjoyable parts of the film, and we get to see a glimmer of some of the Lestat that fans of the books were more used to, as well a brief interaction with Akasha as a statue. Jessie is so obsessed with Lestat that she begs him to turn her into a vampire. It's just odd because it's unusual for Lestat to spend any time with humans and resisting the urge to kill them. So what makes her so special? The film really doesn't answer that. Even though she has information, he's not the kind of character that would bother with that. At one point in the film, she actually cuts herself in a way to kind of tempt him. And I thought this was unintentionally funny because it plays a little into the overdone Hollywood storyline that a beautiful woman can tame any beast. It's also strange because Lestat doesn't actually have much interaction with Jesse in the books. So all of this was contrived for the film. I guess that's my biggest criticism about the film. It doesn't make sense, but it is also unintentionally funny. This version of Lestat is also incredibly lonely. Even though he's mastered his dream of living in the open, he's still massively lonely. Among his wishes, he wants a companion, which is why he never forgets about the violinist he met so long ago. Jessie offers herself as a companion to Lestat. And that's where I thought, okay, that sounds like a cool kind of way to fit her character in this story and make sense. He desires a companion, and Jessie is the offering. Even though I don't quite buy the romance between Lestat and Jessie, I don't mind it either in the context that Lestat can have a companion. Now, there are so many other vampires in the film that are striking visually, but unfortunately, we aren't introduced to them. They just stand around and they look really cool. Now, of the ancient vampire twin witches, we are only introduced to Maharet, who acts as Jessie's aunt, who protects her human family generation after generation. Maharet rounds up a band of vampires to stop Akasha's plan. There's a cool but rather short confrontation. The vampires overcome Akasha by draining her blood. The person to drink her last drop of blood is Maharet, who turns into stone, replacing her as the new Queen of the Damned. Again, the film changes the lore because the other twin, Makar, is the twin that became the Queen of the Damned by consuming Akasha's heart and brain. This is a horror movie. So the movie went a little soft when it came to the horror imagery that was baked into the books. But it got the gist of things that occurred, kind of, you know? So now the technical aspects. The production had its challenges to start out with, being half of the budget of Interview with a Vampire at about $35 million. In order to save money, Michael Reimer convinced the studio to shoot the film in his home city of Melbourne from October 2000 to March 2001. A few scenes were also filmed in Los Angeles. Originally, the big concert was to be in an old theater, but because of the wire work and pyrotechnics, the decision was made to have the concert in an open desert, inspired by Burning Man. Utilizing the thriving goth scene in Australia, over 3,000 to 5,000 extras were filmed at a quarry in Werribee to shoot the concert in the proposed Death Valley, California location for 3 days. They were recruited from several bars and taken by bus to the location. It was a great idea to do this because it really gave the film a much more expensive look. It was pretty epic, to be very, very honest with you. Loved that scene and the look of the concert. From Death Valley to London, I loved the jet setting and globe-trotting in the film. It may have been a distraction a little bit, but I also thought it brought a little something unique to it as well. The bar scenes were completely contrived for the film, which I enjoyed. The Admiral's Arms Vampire Bar in the meatpacking district of London plays homage to the nightclub Mother, which was a real vampire bar in the meatpacking district of New York City. The film excels when it comes to the costumes of the ancient vampires and the work that was done to Akasha's costumes. The makeup was a bit of a hit or a mess, but I didn't mind it so much. Other reviewers complained that the makeup was not as good as it was in Interview with a Vampire. And they're right, because the film took great care to create a special kind of look for the vampires, including visible veins and things like that. But for this production, the makeup wasn't bad in my opinion, although it was minimal. Again, the film had a smaller budget, so something had to give. There was a great deal of digital manipulation to give all the vampires a very surreal, smooth complexion. Another place where you can see that the budget was used were the many forms of Akasha as a statue, her elaborate final death scene, and I totally appreciate all of that work. You would think that a vampire movie would be more bloody and it would be more gory, but blood was used very minimally as well. The actress who played Akasha was Aaliyah, who unfortunately died in a plane crash on August 25th, 2001. She shot all of her scenes but died only 2 days before the Monday morning she was supposed to record her ADR. Her brother Rashad Hassan Houghton, who was very close to his sister, had a deeper but similar voice. He was asked to come in and do some of her ADR. They used her own voice from set, double-tracked it, and added some more special effects to make her voice sound supernatural. I loved the effect because it has a very eerie echo to it. I thought it was well done with what they had to work with. Now, one unique quality of the film is the awesome music selected for the soundtrack and the score. Before the film had even had a cast, the studio and the producers wanted a heavy musical influence to coincide with the film. As luck would have it, Jonathan Davis, singer from the band Korn, was interested into getting into film scoring. He wrote 5 original songs for the film with composer Richard Gibbs, and they were integrated into the score. Sony Records would not actually allow Davis to sing on the soundtrack album release with Warner Brothers. However, they did agree to allow him to sing in the movie, so all of the songs had to be re-recorded and performed by other artists for the album release. Jonathan Davis also made a very small cameo in the film. Now for the performances. Tom Cruise declined the chance to reprise his role as Lestat, and I think with a lower budget and such different artistic choices from Interview with a Vampire, I can see why he didn't do it. Wes Bentley was first hired for the role of Lestat, but dropped out. Heath Ledger got really close to getting the part, but can you believe that the studio thought he wasn't big enough of a star to headline the movie? Wow, they really dropped the ball on that, and plus more. Well, to be honest, he was just starting out at the time. Stuart Townsend was hired to be Aragorn in Lord of the Rings. However, he was let go the day before filming began because they actually really realized at that point that they wanted someone a little older to play the role. When he went for Lestat, he tested well and was well liked because of his effect on the ladies. Townsend is actually pretty good in this. He makes it work, and I think he was well aware of how his performance would be compared to Tom Cruise. And he even said that his version was like a rock and roll tongue-in-cheek version of Lestat. Intentionally or maybe unintentionally, he was trying to get as far away from comparison as possible, including not having the blonde hair that the character should have. Granted, again, the budget for top-notch makeup and wigs was not there, as it was in the case with Tom Cruise, who also has dark hair and dark eyes. I think Stuart is so very underrated as an actor, and I think he gave a special kind of life and mystery to his new version of Lestat. He doesn't get enough credit for what he does in this movie. Now, Cher was interested in the role of Akasha, and she was probably more in line with what Akasha was supposed to physically look like from the book's description. Cher was an Academy Award-winning actress and has musical hits in every decade since the 60s. You just couldn't get anyone more queen-like for the role. But let's consider the reasons why she might not work for this production, because it seems insane that they would not hire her on the spot. First of all, there's the issue of cost, meeting her quality demands, if she had any issue with the quality of the production and the script. all of that would have to be changed for her. And I think that might have been one of the reasons why they wouldn't want to have the movie be kind of handed over to someone who had a higher standard. And with her natural authority in the business, they'd probably want an actress who was more of an ingenue that they could experiment with and discover the character of Akasha together with. And that's exactly what they did. The production decided to go with an African queen. And as chance would have it, Aaliyah was shooting Romeo Must Die for the studio and expressed a genuine interest in acting. They also loved the fact that she had box office draw based on her successful music career. She was also excited about the project because she was a fan of vampire fiction and Egyptian history. Prior to shooting, Michael Reimer had her learn a monologue from Oscar Wilde's Shalom in an Egyptian accent. She won the part and she glowed on screen to the point that she stole the movie. Well, she does play the titular character, and I wish the film included more scenes for her to appear in. Besides the focus on Akasha's seductive physical movements, her facial expressions had so much energy and intensity. She did a fantastic job, and I wish we could have experienced more of her talent along the way as far as acting, singing, and whatever else she had planned. She was definitely on her way up as a superstar. And it was also rumored that she was actually going to be in the Matrix sequel. So what a huge loss for all of us. Many people wondered why Aaliyah had no songs in the movie. She's a songstress, so why not have her music in the film? Well, the filmmakers intended to have a duet between Aaliyah and Jonathan Davis around the last leg of the production, but unfortunately she died before it could happen. Now, the enjoyment. When Aaliyah died, there was a lot of talk about not releasing the film due to the demands of fans. However, her family gave their blessing to move forward with the release because they cited that it was very important to her when she was alive. So, with permission, the film was released 6 months after her death and was dedicated to her memory. The film made back its budget but underperformed for what was expected. Many critics were not pleased that Aaliyah was so heavily used in the marketing but was hardly in the film. They also tried not to market the film as a sequel to Interview with a Vampire, but Anne Rice was so well known, everyone expected more of a connection to the written work, especially when using the title of one of her most profitable books. So I think all of those are valid points, and I actually agree with them. Mistakes were made, and I think that the Vampire Chronicles really need its own TV series with creators dedicated to Anne Rice's vision as accurately as possible, because some of the things in her books are brilliant. You know, they're just incredible. If we look at this film as its own thing, and we considered it an alternative version of Queen of the Damned, it's actually a lot of fun to me with lots of enjoyable elements sprinkled throughout the film. It's an appetizer to what could have been. If you look at this movie, knowing that everyone is giving their best, you can't fault them for that, and I had a lot of fun with it. It's not Anne Rice's Queen of the Damned, but it's my guilty pleasure. My rating is a 7.8. Well, that sums up my review. I hope you liked it, and if you did, I've got over 100 of these videos, so go on and browse the channel to see more reviews from me like this. Subscribe if you haven't done so already, and hit the bell icon to be the very first to be notified of my next video. I want to take this moment to recognize my awesome, amazing, incredible, and super awesome Patreon supporters who are responsible for helping me to produce this video. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, if it wasn't for my Patreon supporters, you wouldn't be seeing this video right now. So many thanks to these incredible movie lovers for their support. And you too can make a difference by heading over to Patreon and getting a little bit of the behind the scenes stuff that you don't get from me on YouTube. Like, what's my next video going to be? And what are the next like 5 or 6 videos am I working on? So all that stuff is over on Patreon, and so go check it out. This is Retro Nerd Girl signing off. Take care, movie lovers. I'm off to my next review.